On a quiet autumn morning, the air was crisp and cool, carrying with it the faint scent of fallen leaves. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden rays across the small suburban neighborhood where Mrs. Evelyn Harper lived. At 82 years old, Miss Evie, as everyone affectionately called her, had spent more than half a century in this very house. It stood on Maple Street, surrounded by tall oak trees that swayed gently in the breeze. Her home wasn't grand or flashy. It was modest, painted a soft blue with white shutters, but it was filled with memories. Every corner told a story: the worn armchair where she used to read bedtime stories to her grandchildren, the kitchen table where family dinners stretched late into the night, and the garden outside where she grew roses, marigolds, and herbs. Miss Evie was known throughout the neighborhood as someone who radiated kindness. She'd been a school teacher for over 40 years, shaping young minds and instilling values of respect, empathy, and hard work. Even after retirement, she remained active in the community. She baked cookies for bake sales, volunteered at the local library, and always greeted passers-by with a warm smile. To many, she was like a second mother, a source of comfort and guidance when life got tough. People often stopped by just to chat, knowing they'd leave feeling lighter, wiser, and more hopeful. That particular morning, Miss Evie woke up early, as she usually did. She made herself a cup of tea, savoring its warmth before heading outside to tend to her garden. Gardening was one of her greatest joys. There was something therapeutic about digging in the soil, pulling weeds, and watching plants grow under her care. Today she focused on watering her flowers, humming an old hymn as she worked. The sound of birds chirping overhead blended perfectly with the rhythm of her movements. Everything seemed peaceful, normal, even mundane, but there was beauty in the simplicity of it all. As she bent down to check on a patch of newly planted daisies, a sudden noise disrupted the tranquility. A police cruiser screeched to a halt right in front of her house. Its tires crunched against the gravel driveway, sending tiny stones skittering across the pavement. Miss Evie straightened up slowly, brushing dirt from her hands onto her apron. She squinted at the vehicle, puzzled. Why would the police be here? She hadn't heard any commotion nearby, nor had anyone mentioned trouble in the area recently. Two officers stepped out of the car, their boots clicking sharply against the ground. They wore dark uniforms with shiny badges pinned to their chests. Their faces were stern, almost intimidating. One of them adjusted his belt while the other glanced around the street as if searching for something, or someone. Miss Evie felt a flicker of unease but quickly dismissed it. Surely they must have a good reason for being here. Perhaps they needed directions or information about a neighbor. She walked toward them, her posture calm, yet curious. "Good morning, officers," she said politely, offering a small wave. "Can I help you with something?" The taller of the two men didn't return her greeting. Instead, he stared at her coldly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Are you Evelyn Harper?" he asked gruffly, his tone devoid of warmth. "Yes, that's me," Miss Evie replied, her voice steady despite the oddness of the situation. "Is everything all right?" "We'll be the ones asking the questions," the other officer interjected, stepping closer. His demeanor was aggressive, his body language confrontational. Miss Evie blinked, taken aback by his rudeness. What could possibly warrant such hostility? "I'm sorry," she said cautiously, "but I don't understand why you're here. Have I done something wrong?" The first officer ignored her question entirely. "We need to see some identification," he demanded, holding out his hand expectantly. Miss Evie hesitated for a moment, then reached into the pocket of her apron. She retrieved her wallet and handed over her driver's license, which displayed her name, address, and photo. As the officer examined it, his expression remained unreadable. Miss Evie waited patiently, though her mind raced with questions. Why were they treating her like a suspect? Had someone filed a complaint against her? Or was this some kind of misunderstanding? Before she could ask again, the second officer spoke up, his voice sharp and accusing. "You're trespassing on private property," he announced abruptly. "Do you deny it?" Miss Evie's eyes widened in disbelief. Trespassing? On her own lawn? The absurdity of the accusation left her speechless for a moment. Finally, she managed to stammer. "Trespassing? This is my house. I've lived here for over 50 years. The officers exchanged a glance, but neither softened their stance. If anything, they seemed even more determined to intimidate her. "You'll have to come with us," the taller one said firmly, reaching for his handcuffs. "What?" Miss Evie exclaimed, instinctively taking a step back. "No, wait, you can't do this. I haven't done anything." But her protests fell on deaf ears. Without another word, the officer grabbed her arms, gently at first, then with increasing force, and twisted them behind her back. The metal cuffs clicked shut around her wrists, biting into her fragile skin. Pain shot through her shoulders and tears sprang to her eyes. She struggled to comprehend what was happening. How could this be real? How could these men, sworn to protect and serve, treat her so cruelly? Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some watched silently from their doorways, too afraid to intervene. Others peered through curtains, whispering among themselves. Miss Evie caught glimpses of familiar faces, people she'd known for decades, but none of them came forward to defend her. Fear hung heavy in the air, mingling with the scent of freshly cut grass. As the officers led her toward the cruiser, Miss Evie stumbled slightly, her legs weak beneath her. One of them opened the back door, shoving her inside roughly. She landed, awkwardly on the vinyl seat, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Through the window, she saw her beloved garden fading into the distance as the car pulled away. Humiliation burned in her chest, mixing with anger and confusion. All she could think was, why me? What did I ever do to deserve this? And so what had started as a peaceful morning turned into a nightmare, one that would test Miss Evie's strength, resilience, and faith in humanity. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would expose deep-rooted injustices and inspire others to stand up for what was right. The inside of the police cruiser felt suffocating. The air was stale and the vinyl seats were cold against Miss Evie's skin. Her hands, still cuffed behind her back, throbbed with pain, but it was the weight of humiliation that pressed hardest, on her chest. She stared out the window as the familiar streets of her neighborhood rolled by, each passing house a reminder of the life she had built over decades, a life now being torn apart without explanation. Miss Evie tried to steady her, breathing, but her heart raced uncontrollably. She replayed the events in her mind, searching for answers. What had she done to deserve this? Was there some mistake? Had someone falsely accused her? Her thoughts tumbled over one another like waves crashing against rocks, chaotic and relentless. The two officers sat silently in the front seat, their faces hardened, offering no reassurance or clarification. To them, she wasn't a person. She was just another case, or so it seemed. As the car sped toward the precinct, Miss Evie noticed something unsettling. The officer driving kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror. His eyes weren't curious or sympathetic. They were calculating, almost predatory. It made her stomach churn. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to avoid his gaze, but every time she looked away, he'd peer at her again. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she spoke up. "Please," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Can you tell me what's going on? Why am I here?" The driver smirked, exchanging a quick glance with his partner before responding. "You'll find out soon enough," he said dismissively, his tone dripping with disdain. Miss Evie swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to argue, to demand justice, but fear rooted her to the spot. At 82 years old, she had lived long enough to recognize cruelty when she saw it, and these men radiated it. Their actions weren't about enforcing the law, they were about asserting power, making her feel small and insignificant. And yet, despite everything, a flicker of defiance burned within her. She wouldn't let them break her spirit, not completely. When they arrived at the precinct, the officers pulled into the parking lot with unnecessary force, slamming on the brakes so abruptly that Miss Evie lurched forward. They opened the door and dragged her out, none too gently. Her knees buckled under her weight, but they held her upright. gripping her arms tightly as if afraid she might try to escape. As they marched her inside, heads turned. Other officers and civilians waiting in the lobby stared openly, some with pity, others with indifference. No one intervened. No one asked why an elderly woman was being treated like a criminal. They led her down a narrow hallway lit by harsh fluorescent lights, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and clinical. Miss Evie's heart sank further with each step. She had never been inside a police station before, at least not like this. In her younger days, she had visited occasionally to discuss community safety initiatives or mentor youth programs, always welcomed warmly. Now she was a prisoner, stripped of dignity and respect. The officers pushed open a heavy metal door and shoved her into a small windowless room. The space was bare except for a single table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. A flickering overhead light cast eerie shadows on the gray walls. One of the officers removed her handcuffs, leaving red marks around her wrists, then gestured for her to sit. Miss Evie hesitated, unsure whether to comply or resist. Ultimately, exhaustion won out, and she lowered herself onto the hard chair, wincing as pain shot through her joints. "You stay put," the taller officer growled, pointing a finger at her. "Don't move unless we say so." With that, they left, slamming the door shut behind them. The loud clang reverberated through the room, sealing her isolation. For the first time since her arrest, Miss Evie allowed herself to cry. Silent tears streamed down her cheeks as she rested her head in her hands. She felt utterly alone, abandoned by the very system meant to protect her. How could this happen? Why would anyone target her like this? Time passed slowly, each minute, stretching into eternity. The room grew colder and Miss Evie wrapped her arms around herself for warmth. Her mind wandered back to happier days, picnics in the park with her grandchildren, lively debates in her classroom, quiet evenings spent reading by the fireplace. Those memories provided fleeting comfort, but they also deepened her despair. Would she ever experience such joy again? Or was this the beginning of the end? After what felt like hours, the door creaked open, and the shorter officer returned. He carried a clipboard and a pen, his expression unreadable. Without saying a word, he placed both items on the table and sat across from her. For several moments, he simply stared at her, studying her face as if trying to decipher a puzzle. Miss Evie met his gaze nervously, unsure of what to expect. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Listen carefully," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "We know who you are, Evelyn. You're not just some nobody. Your family has connections, money, influence. That means you can make this go away." Quietly, Miss Evie frowned, confusion clouding her features. "Make what go away?" she asked cautiously. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Come on, don't play dumb. We've got you on trespassing charges. Unless you want this dragging out in court, and trust me, things could get messy, you'll cooperate." Miss Evie's breath caught in her throat. Blackmail. That's what this was. These men weren't interested in justice. They wanted money. They thought they could exploit her vulnerability, use her age and reputation against her. Anger bubbled beneath her surface, hot and fierce, but she forced herself to remain calm. Losing her temper wouldn't help her now. "I'm sorry," she said firmly, meeting his gaze head-on. "But I won't be bullied. If you think I've broken the law, prove it, otherwise let me go." The officer's smile faded, replaced by a scowl. Clearly, he hadn't expected resistance. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Suit yourself," he muttered, "but don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he stood and exited the room, leaving Miss Evie alone once more. Though her body ached and her mind reeled with uncertainty, she felt a strange sense of pride. Despite their attempts to intimidate her, she had refused to back down. That small victory gave her strength, even as the hours dragged on and the reality of her situation settled in. Outside the interrogation room, whispers echoed through the precinct. Officers discussed the old lady locked away in the holding cell, speculating about her guilt or innocence. Some joked cruelly, mocking her age and frailty. Others remained silent, their expressions unreadable. Among them stood Detective Marcus Lane, a young officer new to the force. He had only joined the department 6 months ago, eager to serve his community and uphold the law. But as he listened to his colleagues' callous remarks, unease crept into his chest. Something about this case didn't sit right with him. Why would an elderly woman like Miss Evie be arrested for trespassing? It sounded absurd, almost laughable. Yet here she was, sitting in a cold, sterile room while seasoned officers dismissed her plight. Determined to uncover the truth, Marcus decided to investigate further. Little did he know, his curiosity would set off a chain of events that would change not only Miss Evie's fate, but his own understanding of justice and morality. For now, though, Miss Evie remained trapped in her nightmare, clinging to hope amidst the darkness. The hours dragged on endlessly for Miss Evie, each minute stretching like an eternity in the cold, sterile confines of the interrogation room. The flickering fluorescent light above her buzzed faintly, casting uneven shadows across the walls. Her wrists ached from the tight grip of the handcuffs earlier, and though they had been removed, the red marks remained as a stark reminder of her ordeal. She sat hunched over, her hands clasped tightly together on the table, trying to steady her breathing. Her mind raced with questions. What do they want from me? Why are they doing this? But no answers came, only silence and the oppressive weight of uncertainty. Detective Marcus Lane stood outside the interrogation room, his arms crossed as he observed through the one-way mirror. He had arrived at the precinct late that morning, after responding to a minor traffic incident elsewhere in the city. When he heard murmurs about an elderly woman being brought in for trespassing, his curiosity was piqued. Something about the story didn't add up. Trespassing charges were usually reserved for squatters or repeat offenders, not someone like Miss Evie Harper, whose name carried respect in the community. Marcus leaned closer to the glass, studying her carefully. Even in her current state, exhausted, disheveled, and visibly shaken, there was an undeniable dignity about her. She sat upright despite her discomfort, her posture speaking of resilience. Her eyes, though weary, still held a spark of defiance. Whoever she was, whatever her story, Marcus knew instinctively that she didn't belong here. Yet instead of releasing her, the officers seemed determined to keep her detained, their motives unclear. Inside the room, Miss Evie's thoughts drifted between anger and fear. She replayed the officer's words in her head. "You can make this go away," quietly. It was blackmail, plain and simple. They wanted money, or something else she couldn't yet fathom, and they thought her age and reputation made her an easy target. The audacity of it infuriated her. After decades of teaching children fairness and integrity, here she was, facing corruption and greed masked as authority. It felt surreal, almost like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. Her frustration boiled over when the shorter officer returned, slamming the door behind him. His demeanor had shifted. Gone was the calculated calm, replaced by impatience and hostility. He dropped a file folder onto the table with a thud, scattering papers across its surface. Miss Evie flinched but refused to look away, meeting his glare with unwavering resolve. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he snapped, leaning forward until his face was inches from hers. "Just pay us off and we'll drop the charges, simple as that." Miss Evie's jaw tightened. "I already told you," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I haven't done anything wrong and I won't give into extortion. If you have evidence against me, show it, otherwise let me leave." The officer scoffed, shaking his head. "You think you're clever, don't you? Playing the innocent victim." He opened the folder and pulled out a grainy photograph. "Recognize this?" Miss Evie squinted at the image. It showed a figure standing near a fence, partially obscured by shadows. At first glance, it could have been anyone. But the officer clearly intended for her to believe it was her. "That's not me," she said flatly, pushing the photo back toward him. "And even if it were, why would I trespass on my own property?" The officer smirked, clearly enjoying her discomfort. Funny thing about photos, they can be interpreted however we want. And right now, they say you were where you shouldn't have been. Miss Evie's heart sank. Fabricated evidence. This was worse than she'd imagined. These men weren't just trying to intimidate her. They were willing to lie, cheat, and manipulate the truth to get what they wanted. Fear clawed at her insides, but she forced herself to stay composed. Giving in to panic wouldn't help her now. As the standoff continued, Marcus watched intently from the other side of the glass. Something about the officer's behavior struck him as suspicious. The way he loomed over Miss Evie, his tone laced with thinly veiled threats. It wasn't protocol. Officers were trained to remain professional during interrogations, especially with vulnerable individuals like the elderly. Yet here was this man, practically bullying her into submission. It was unethical, possibly illegal, and Marcus couldn't ignore it. He decided to dig deeper. Leaving his post at the observation window, he approached the desk sergeant stationed nearby. "What's going on with the woman in room 3? He asked casually, keeping his tone neutral. The sergeant shrugged, barely glancing up from his paperwork. "Some trespassing nonsense. Nothing major." "Trespassing?" Marcus repeated, raising an eyebrow. "On whose property?" The sergeant hesitated, then muttered, "Her own, apparently." "Weird case." Marcus frowned. "If it's her property, why is she still here? Shouldn't we release her?" The sergeant sighed, clearly annoyed by the line of questioning. "Look, kid, it's complicated. Just focus on your own cases, all right?" But Marcus wasn't satisfied. Something about the situation gnawed at him, refusing to let go. He excused himself and headed to the records room, determined to uncover more details. Inside, he sifted through recent arrest reports, searching for any mention of Miss Evie Harper. What he found shocked him. There was virtually no evidence supporting the trespassing charge. No witness statements, no surveillance footage, nothing concrete. The entire case seemed built on speculation and coercion. Determined to learn more, Marcus accessed the department's internal database and ran a background check on Miss Evie. As the information loaded, he braced himself for whatever he might discover. To his astonishment, the results painted a picture far different from what he'd expected. Miss Evie wasn't just an ordinary citizen, she was a trailblazer. Decades ago, she had played a pivotal role in desegregating schools in the South, earning national recognition for her activism. She had testified before Congress advocating for equal education opportunities for all children. Her contributions to society were immeasurable, yet here she was, locked in a holding cell, treated like a criminal. Marcus stared at the screen, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions: shame, anger, and determination. How could anyone justify treating someone like Miss Evie this way? The injustice of it burned within him, fueling his resolve to act. He printed out the relevant documents and tucked them under his arm, ready to confront the officers involved. Meanwhile, back in the interrogation room, the tension between Miss Evie and the officer reached a boiling point. Frustrated by her refusal to cooperate, he resorted to more aggressive tactics. "You're playing a dangerous game, Evelyn," he growled, slamming his fist on the table. "We can make this disappear, or we can make sure everyone knows exactly who you are. Your family, your neighbors, the press. Think about how embarrassing that would be." Miss Evie clenched her fists, fighting back tears. "You're bluffing," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "You have nothing on me." "Oh, we have plenty," the officer sneered, leaning in close. "All it takes is one phone call to ruin your life. Is that what you want?" For a moment, doubt crept into Miss Evie's mind. Could they really follow through on their threats? Would they stoop so low as to tarnish her reputation, dragging her name through the mud? The thought terrified her, but she refused to let it break her. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself and looked the officer straight in the eye. "Do your worst," she said quietly, her voice filled with quiet strength. "I've faced worse than you." Her defiance caught the officer off guard. He hesitated, clearly unprepared for such resilience. For a brief moment, his mask of confidence slipped, revealing a flicker of uncertainty. But before he could respond, the door swung open and Marcus entered the room. "Excuse me," Marcus said sharply, his tone authoritative. "I need to speak with you outside." The officer scowled, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Can't this wait?" he snapped. "No," Marcus replied firmly. "It can't." Reluctantly, the officer followed Marcus into the hallway, leaving Miss Evie alone once again. She watched them through the doorway, her heart pounding. Who was this new man and why had he intervened? Though she couldn't hear their conversation, she noticed the heated exchange, the officer growing increasingly defensive while Marcus remained calm but resolute. Whatever was happening, it gave her a glimmer of hope. Back in the hallway, Marcus wasted no time confronting the officer. "What's going on here?" he demanded, holding up the printed documents. "This woman hasn't committed any crime. You're holding her based on fabricated evidence and intimidation tactics. That's not justice, that's abuse of power." The officer's face turned red with rage. "Stay out of this, rookie," he spat. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," Marcus shot back, his voice firm. "And unless you want me to report this to Internal Affairs, you'll release her immediately." The threat hung heavy in the air. The officer hesitated, weighing his options. Finally, with a muttered curse, he stormed off, leaving Marcus standing, alone in the corridor. Breathing deeply, Marcus collected himself before re-entering the interrogation room. Miss Evie looked up as he approached, her expression wary but hopeful. "Who are you?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Marcus knelt beside her chair, his gaze softening. "My name is Detective Marcus Lane," he said gently. Detective Marcus Lane stood in the precinct's dimly lit hallway, clutching the documents he had gathered about Miss Evie Harper. His mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle before him. The more he learned, the angrier he became. Not just at the blatant injustice being inflicted on Miss Evie, but also at the systemic rot that allowed such corruption to fester unchecked. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, one he suspected ran deeper than anyone cared to admit. Determined to uncover the truth, Marcus returned to his desk and began poring over old case files. He started with recent arrests, involving similar charges: trespassing, loitering, or vague accusations of suspicious behavior. Patterns quickly emerged. Many of the cases involved black residents, often elderly individuals or those who lacked the resources to fight back against false allegations. Some had been coerced into paying fines they couldn't afford, while others were threatened with fabricated evidence if they refused to comply. It was a chilling revelation. These officers weren't enforcing the law. They were exploiting their badges for personal gain. As Marcus sifted through the records, he noticed something else troubling. Several complaints had been filed against the same group of officers over the years, alleging misconduct ranging from verbal abuse to outright extortion. Yet none of these complaints had led to disciplinary action. They were either dismissed outright or buried under bureaucratic red tape. It was as though the department had turned a blind eye, allowing bad actors to operate with impunity. Marcus's blood boiled as he read through testimonies from victims who had dared to speak out. One woman described how she was detained for hours without explanation, only to be released after promising not to pursue legal action. Another recounted how officers demanded cash payments to avoid trumped-up charges. Each story echoed Miss Evie's experience, reinforcing what Marcus already suspected. This was systemic corruption, and it needed to end. But exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. Marcus knew he was stepping into dangerous territory. Challenging, powerful figures within the department meant risking his career, and possibly his safety. Still, he couldn't ignore the moral weight of what he'd uncovered. Miss Evie's courage in standing up to her oppressors inspired him to do the same. If she could face intimidation with dignity, then so could he. With renewed determination, Marcus decided to dig even deeper. He reached out discreetly to colleagues whose integrity he trusted, asking subtle questions about the officers involved in Miss Evie's case. Most responded cautiously, wary of drawing attention to themselves. but a few shared fragments of information, rumors of late-night meetings, unexplained wealth, and connections to questionable individuals outside the force. These whispers painted a disturbing picture, a network of corrupt officers operating beneath the radar, preying on vulnerable members of the community. One name kept surfacing during his conversations: Officer Greg Dawson, the taller of the two, men who had arrested Miss Evie. According to rumors, Dawson had a reputation for targeting marginalized groups, using his position to intimidate and exploit. Several sources claimed he was involved in shady dealings beyond simple bribery, though no one dared provide specifics. Marcus made a mental note to investigate Dawson further, knowing full well the risks involved. While gathering evidence, Marcus also took time to reflect on his own role in all of this. As a relatively new member of the force, he had initially viewed policing as a noble profession, an opportunity to serve and protect. But now, faced with undeniable proof of corruption, he questioned whether he truly belonged in such a flawed system. Could he stay and fight for change from within, or would he become complicit by association? The answer came to him one evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, staring at the stack of documents spread across his kitchen table. He thought about Miss Evie, the strength she had shown despite her fear, the way she refused to let injustice define her. She reminded him of why he had joined the force in the first place, to make a difference, however small. If he walked away now, he would be abandoning not just her, but everyone else affected by this corruption. No matter how daunting the challenge, he owed it to them, and to himself, to see it through. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the precinct earlier than usual. He spent hours reviewing surveillance footage from the day of Miss Evie's arrest, searching for anything that might corroborate her account. What he found confirmed his suspicions. There was no evidence of trespassing or wrongdoing on her part. Instead, the video clearly showed the officers approaching her aggressively, handcuffing her without cause and dragging her into the cruiser. It was damning proof of misconduct, captured on camera yet ignored by those in power. Armed with this new evidence, Marcus prepared to take his findings to Captain Reynolds, the precinct's commanding officer. He knew it wouldn't be an easy conversation. Reynolds had a reputation for prioritizing public image over accountability, often sweeping scandals under the rug to avoid scrutiny. But Marcus had no choice. Escalating the issue was the only way to ensure justice for Miss Evie and hold the guilty parties accountable. When Marcus entered Reynolds' office later that afternoon, the captain barely glanced up from his desk. "What is it, Lane?" he asked irritably, shuffling through a pile of paperwork. "I'm busy." "I need to discuss something urgent," Marcus replied, closing the door behind him. "It's about the Harper case." Reynolds froze, his pen hovering mid-air. Slowly, he set it down and leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with narrowed eyes. "What about it?" Marcus laid out the evidence methodically, presenting the surveillance footage, the fabricated charges, and the history of misconduct linked to the arresting officers. He spoke calmly but firmly, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "This isn't just about Miss Harper," he concluded. "It's about a pattern of abuse that's been allowed to continue unchecked. We can't ignore it any longer." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples as though trying to ward off a headache. "You're stepping into dangerous waters, kid," he said finally. "People don't like having their dirty laundry aired." "I'm not doing this to cause trouble," Marcus shot back. "I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. If we don't address this now, it'll only get worse." Reynolds stared at him for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. "All right," he said, his tone resigned. "I'll look into it, but don't expect miracles. Changing things around here takes time." Marcus left the office feeling a mix of relief and unease. While Reynolds' response was better than outright dismissal, he knew the battle was far from over. Real change rarely came easily, especially when entrenched interests were at stake. Still, he felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in days, he believed progress was possible, if enough people were willing to fight for it. Later that evening, Marcus returned to the holding area where Miss Evie was still being detained. Her spirits had lifted slightly since their earlier encounter, but fatigue lingered in her eyes. When she saw him approach, she offered a faint smile. "Detective Lane," she greeted softly. "Any news?" "Yes," Marcus replied, pulling up a chair beside her. "I've reviewed the evidence and it's clear you've done nothing wrong. I'm working to get you released as soon as possible." Miss Evie's expression softened with gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured. "Not just for helping me, but for believing me when others didn't." Her words struck a chord deep within Marcus. In that moment, he realized the true weight of his responsibility, not just as a detective, but as a human being. Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about restoring faith in a system that had failed too many for too long, and Miss Evie, with her quiet resilience and unwavering dignity, embodied the very spirit of hope that kept him fighting. As they sat together in the dimly lit room, Marcus vowed silently to see this through to the end. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them head-on, for Miss Evie, for the community, and for the belief that even in the darkest times light could still prevail. Detective Marcus Lane sat in the precinct's dimly lit break room, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in his hands. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching longer than the last. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, replaying the events of the past few days and weighing the enormity of what he had uncovered. The evidence against officers Greg Dawson and his partner was damning. Fabricated charges, extortion attempts, and years of unchecked misconduct, but exposing it would be no small feat. These men weren't lone wolves. They were part of a larger web, one that extended into the very fabric of the department. Taking them down meant challenging not just individuals, but an entire system designed to protect its own. Marcus knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people who shared his commitment to justice and were willing to risk their careers for the greater good. But finding such allies within the precinct was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Trust was a rare commodity among officers, especially when it came to matters as explosive as corruption. Still, Marcus decided to start small. Over the next few days, he quietly approached a handful of colleagues whose integrity he respected, officers who had shown compassion toward the community or pushed back against questionable practices. One of them was Officer Lisa Chen, a seasoned detective known for her meticulous work ethic and moral compass. She had been with the force for over a decade, long enough to understand its flaws, but still hold on to hope for reform. When Marcus cautiously broached the subject with her during a late-night shift, she listened intently, her expression unreadable at first. By the time he finished laying out the details, her jaw was set in determination. "This isn't the first time I've heard rumors about Dawson and his crew," Lisa admitted, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "But nobody ever had proof until now." "Will you help me?" Marcus asked, his voice low but urgent. "We can't let this slide." Lisa hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to the badge and the risks involved in speaking out. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said firmly, "but we need to be smart about this. If we rush in blindly, we'll lose before we even begin." With Lisa on board, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they began strategizing how best to present their findings without tipping off the corrupt officers. They agreed to compile a comprehensive dossier, including surveillance footage, witness testimonies, internal complaints, and any other relevant documentation. Every piece of evidence was cross-checked and verified, ensuring there could be no loopholes or excuses once it landed on Captain Reynolds's desk. As they worked tirelessly behind the scenes, Marcus found himself reflecting on Miss Evie Harper, the woman at the center of this storm. Her courage and resilience continued to inspire him, even as the weight of the investigation pressed heavily on his shoulders. He visited her regularly in the holding area, updating her on their progress while doing his best to reassure her. Though she remained composed, he could see the toll this ordeal was taking on her. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually warm demeanor had grown quieter, more guarded. Yet despite everything, she never lost faith, not in herself nor in the possibility of justice prevailing. "You're doing the right thing," she told Marcus one evening, her voice soft but steady. "Even if it feels impossible, keep going. People like you give us hope." Her words stayed with him, fueling his resolve when doubt crept in. For every step forward, it seemed there were 2 steps back. Internal politics slowed their efforts, forcing Marcus and Lisa to navigate a labyrinth of red tape and bureaucratic hurdles. At times, it felt like they were fighting an uphill battle against forces far greater than themselves. But neither of them gave up. They knew too much was at stake, not just for Miss Evie, but for everyone who had suffered under the same oppressive system. Their breakthrough came unexpectedly, thanks to a tip from an unlikely source: a civilian employee working in the precinct's records department. The woman, whose name was Sarah, had overheard fragments of conversations between Dawson and his cronies, enough to confirm their suspicions. When Marcus and Lisa approached her discreetly, she agreed to share what she knew, but only if her identity remained anonymous. Her testimony provided critical context, linking the officer's actions to a broader pattern of corruption involving several high-ranking officials. Armed with this new information, Marcus and Lisa finalized their report and scheduled a meeting with Captain Reynolds. This time they came prepared, not just with evidence but with a clear plan of action. They outlined specific steps the department could take to address the issue, from suspending the implicated officers pending investigation to implementing stricter oversight measures moving forward. It was a bold move, one that required both courage and conviction. As they laid everything out on the table, Marcus watched Reynolds closely, gauging his reaction. To their surprise, the captain didn't immediately dismiss their claims. Instead, he listened intently, his expression grim as he absorbed the gravity of the situation. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples thoughtfully. "This is complicated," he admitted after a long pause. "If word gets out, it'll blow up in our faces." "It already has," Marcus countered, his tone firm but respectful. "The question is whether we want to control the narrative or let someone else do it for us." Reynolds sighed, clearly conflicted. After several tense moments, he nodded reluctantly. "All right," he said. "I'll authorize an internal investigation, but I need your assurance that you'll handle this carefully. No leaks, no grandstanding. Let's deal with this internally for now." Though the response wasn't ideal, it was a start. Marcus and Lisa exchanged a glance, silently acknowledging the significance of the moment. They had succeeded in forcing the department to confront its demons, however reluctantly. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was progress. Later that day, Marcus went to Miss Evie's holding cell to deliver the news. She was sitting upright on the cot, staring absently at the wall, but her face lit up when she saw him. "Well?" she asked, her voice tinged with cautious optimism. "They're launching an investigation," Marcus replied, managing a small smile. "It's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction." Miss Evie exhaled deeply, relief washing over her features. "Thank you," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "You've given me more than my freedom. You've reminded me that there are still good people in this world." Her gratitude humbled Marcus, filling him with a mix of pride and responsibility. He realized then that this fight wasn't just about dismantling corruption. It was about restoring faith in institutions, in humanity, and in the power of collective action. Miss Evie's strength had ignited something within him, a spark that refused to be extinguished. And as he left the precinct that evening, he carried that spark with him, knowing it would guide him through whatever challenges lay ahead. Change wouldn't come overnight, but Marcus was determined to see it through. For Miss Evie, for the countless others who had been wronged, and for the belief that even the darkest systems could be reformed, one brave act at a time.